From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Monday, July 1. Australian Border Force allegedly gave a group of failed asylum seekers a speedboat and told them to return to Indonesia. That story's live at theaustralian.com.au right now. Anthony Albanese has summoned rogue Senator Fatima Payman to the Lodge and kicked her out of caucus, the group of Labor MPs who vote on party policies. That's after she crossed the floor to vote for a Greens motion recognising Palestine as a state. Does Joe Biden have Parkinson's? Will he stand aside? And if so, for whom? Is Michelle Obama really a possible saviour for the Democrats? After Donald Trump wiped the floor with a hesitant, confused Joe Biden in the presidential debate, we chart the way forward with foreign editor Greg Sheridan. If you're into American politics, or frankly, even if you're not, there's one topic of conversation you've been thinking about for the past few days.
Hi Claire, how are you?
What on earth is going on with Joe Biden?
What we do when Biden and Trump pass from the stage, honestly.
We have nothing to talk about. I rang our foreign editor, Greg Sheridan, who's an expert at the huge spectacle of American elections. Because this election just became seriously weird with the first, and maybe the only, presidential debate.
This was Democrats' worst nightmare.
Just a day after Mr. Biden's debate performance sparks concerns about his age.
Donald Trump emerged as the winner of the debate, where he was seen more nimble and disciplined compared to 2020.
This cannot be real life. It just can't. We're America. God.
Well, I was watching it with my laptop on my knees because I was blogging throughout, and it was a joy. There's never been a presidential debate like it. The deranged versus the demented.
We got to take a look at what I was left when I became president and what Mr. Trump left me. We had an economy that was in free fall. The pandemic was so badly handled.
Biden's cognitive capabilities have been in obvious decline for a couple of years, and friends of mine who work for him, people in the administration always say, oh no, privately, he's tough-minded and he knows what he's doing. And I believe he is still kind of compos mentis in the broad sense, but he is plainly not up to any kind of demanding job.
What I'm going to do is fix the tax system. For example, we have 1,000 trillionaires in America. Billionaires in America.
And when he started speaking, his voice was so raspy and thin and quiet. And you think, where is the preparation here? He's allegedly had a week of preparation. And you think just before he went on stage, you think he'd have a gargle with Listerine or something and make sure his voice was clear and strong. I mean, his voice got a bit better.
We'd be able to wipe out his debt. We'd be able to help make sure that all those things we need to do, child care, elder care, making sure that we continue to strengthen our healthcare system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID.
But the whole thing was just incomprehensible, really. And then he had so many moments where he just couldn't gather his thoughts and stumbled and so forth that was cruel. You felt sad for him, but on the other hand, you also felt outraged that this was what American democracy was presenting. The administration thought this was a reasonable person to be president.
With dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Thank you, President Biden. President Trump?
Well, he's right. He did beat Medicare. He beat it to death, and he's destroying Medicare because all of these people are coming in. They're putting.
Yeah, he'd spent a week of prep at the presidential retreat, Camp David, being presumably coached by his advisors and doing mock debates. Maybe that's what had made his voice hoarse. But did you get the sense in the early minutes of the debate that he seemed like somebody who had done a lot of prep and had been coached?
No, and that's what struck me about it. So Sarah Palin was not an impressive vice presidential candidate in the end and didn't really have an intellectual mastery of the issues. but she did exceptionally well in her debate against Joe Biden.
Oh, man, it's so obvious that I'm a Washington outsider and someone just not used to the way you guys operate, because here you voted for the war and now you oppose the war.
And she did that by memorising about 30 or 40 answers. So you know for sure what issues are going to come up. And it doesn't matter what form the question takes. If the question is about Iran or something, here's your prepared answer on Iran. Now, it just seems that Biden is simply too old to hold even 10 or 15 formulations in his head.
Now to the issue of immigration and border security, President Biden, a record number of migrants have illegally crossed the southern border on your watch. Why should voters trust you to solve this crisis?
Because we worked very hard to get a bipartisan agreement that not only changed all of that, it made sure that we are in a situation where you had no circumstance where they could come across the border with the number of border.
The special prosecutor who looked into his handling of documents recently, who said, look, this is an older man with a very poor memory, and I don't think we can prosecute him because he would just be able to say, I can't remember anything. That's okay. That doesn't make him a bad person or anything. We're all going to get there eventually, but it doesn't make you fit to be President of the United States.
What I've done since I've changed the law, what's happened? I've changed it in a way that now you're in a situation where there are 40% fewer people coming across the border illegally. It's better than when he left office. And I'm going to continue to move until we get the total ban on the total initiative relative to what we're going to do with more Border Patrol and more asylum officers.
President Trump?
Donald Trump is 78. Joe Biden is 81. He'll turn 82 in November. But they seemed as though there was a lot more than 3 years between them, didn't they?
They sure did. So I know a lot of folks in their 80s who would be perfectly okay on a debate stage. And the West has had many leaders in their 80s, Konrad Adenauer in West Germany and Winston Churchill and so on.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am now nearing the end of my journey. I hope I still have some services to render.
And that was before modern science kept everyone fit and healthier for a lot longer. Trump tells manifold lies, but Trump is just a liar.
Will you pledge tonight that once all legal challenges have been exhausted, that you will accept the results of this election, regardless of who wins, and you will say right now that political violence in any form is unacceptable?
Well, I shouldn't have to say that, but of course I believe that. It's totally unacceptable. And if you would see my statements that I made on Twitter at the time, and also my statement that I made in the Rose Garden, you would say it's one of the strongest statements you've ever seen. In addition to the speech I made in front of, I believe, the largest crowd I've ever spoken to, and I will tell you, nobody ever talks about that. They talk about a relatively small number of people that went to the Capitol, and in many cases were ushered in by the police.
You know that he's in touch with reality. He just says things that aren't true. What the problem seems with Biden is that he just doesn't seem to be able to distinguish reality from fantasy. So he keeps saying that unemployment was 15% when he took office, and everybody keeps pointing out to him that that's wrong. It was less than half that. And actually, Trump's performance by Trump's standards was astonishingly disciplined and very effective. And the contrast with Biden was quite shocking.
So let's talk about the Donald Trump that we saw that night. I thought at any moment he might say, look, this man's got dementia, clearly. He can't even string a sentence together. But he didn't really go there, did he? There was one moment where he said President Biden doesn't really know what he just meant by the end of that sentence.
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either. Look.
But he didn't go for the throat in the way that we might have expected him to. Do you think Trump is trying to appeal to a different demographic?
Well, I thought Trump was, by his standards, simply astonishingly self-disciplined. So the rules which were designed to help Biden actually helped Trump enormously. 4 years ago when they debated, every time Biden started to falter, Trump started to shout at him.
The issue is the American people should speak. You should go out and vote. You're in voting now. vote and let your senators know how strongly you feel. Vote now.
Are you going to pack the
Make
court?
sure you, in fact, let people know
He doesn't want
you're
to
a
answer the
senator.
question.
I'm not going to answer the question
Why
because
wouldn't you answer that
because
question?
the question
you
is
want to put a lot of
the
new
question
Supreme Court
is
justice,
the
radical
question-
left.
Will you
Who
shut
is
up,
your,
man?
Listen, who is on your list?
And that meant that Trump was sort of providing a blanket of protection for Biden. His mangled sentences were never exposed because Trump was always interrupting him. So that not only saved Biden, but it made Trump look really nasty and like a playground bully. Now, some of his supporters like that, but it turns off a lot of normal people, turns off independent voters and so on. Now, the rules here were that if you spoke out of turn when you were not supposed to be speaking, they would mute your microphones. So Trump accepted that, and basically he didn't try to talk out of turn. But not only that, like you, I expected him to be much tougher on Biden's gaffes. But I think it was a conscious decision that he would be fairly restrained and just let Biden speak for himself, if you know what I mean. Biden quite rationally tried to goad Trump a few times, said you slept with a porn star, you've got the morals of an alley cat and all that.
How many billions of dollars do you owe in civil penalties for molesting a woman in public, for doing a whole range of things, of having sex with a porn star on the night while your wife was pregnant? I mean, what are you talking about? You have the morals of an alley cat.
But for once in his life, Trump didn't rise to the debate.
I didn't have sex with a porn star, number one. Number two, that was a case that was started and moved. They moved a high-ranking official, a DOJ, into the Manhattan DA's office to start that case.
And Trump is so much more effective when he is talking about the issues and talking about Biden's record. He didn't want the debate to be all about Trump. Oddly enough, even though Trump is a tremendous narcissist, he wanted the debate to be about Biden, and it was tremendously to Biden's detriment.
Coming up after the break, so who can the Democrats get? While I've got you, we'd love you to get more of this journalism by subscribing to The Australian at theaustralian.com.au. We'll be back after the break. Not surprisingly, the Democrats are starting to panic. But they're in a confusing situation now, Greg, because Biden has got the majority of votes at the primaries, the contests where registered Democrats choose which candidate they want. How could Joe Biden be replaced if the Democrats do want that? Is this going to be a matter for Joe Biden himself?
Basically, it has to be a matter for Joe Biden himself. There is a provision in the Constitution that if the cabinet decides the president is infirm, they can replace him. There's no chance of that happening. But of course, Biden, I think, is a very mixed grill. I think he's been a pretty poor president. But one quality that he has in abundance, superabundance, is stubbornness and orneriness. And he has that almost insane self-belief, which any leader has. He'd never won a presidential primary. He was always the also-ran and so on. And then circumstances just worked for him perfectly when the Democratic Party needed a mainstream person to run against Trump. And it's going to be hard to convince Biden that his position is untenable. So I think a lot of senior Democrats are trying to persuade him to stand aside. But unless they persuade him, he is the nominee. I think one reason he chose Kamala Harris as his vice president and then has kept her in the shadows all through her term is that he never wanted the vice president to be seen to be an alternative to him. There's a very long tradition of that in all presidential politics. Richard Nixon chose first Spiro Agnew, then Gerald Ford, because he thought they were both such mediocre dunderheads that nobody would ever want them to be president. Eisenhower chose Nixon on the same basis, really. Franklin Roosevelt's vice presidents, until he got to Harry Truman, were absolute shockers. Leaders generally systematically get rid of alternatives, and then there's a terrible moment of truth when the leader has to go that you don't have any alternatives.
One of the alternatives, on paper at least, is Kamala Harris. She's the vice president. She's a former lawyer, a district attorney, then she was a senator. She, on the surface, Greg, has appealed to demographics that the Democrats need. For example, people of colour in the United States. She has Indian and an African-American heritage. Why is she not the dream candidate who the Democrats are now turning towards with hope?
You can't really pick a politician on the basis of ticking identity politics boxes. So when Bill Clinton was president, he was terrified that Colin Powell was going to run against him for the Republicans, because Powell was just a magnificent public figure whom everyone in the United States loved. He was also African American. Kamala Harris, Joe Biden picked her because she was a minority box ticker. But the problem is Kamala Harris has shown no signs of being a very effective politician. She came absolutely nowhere in the Democratic primaries. She might, in theory, appeal to African Americans, but they didn't vote for her. I think very cruelly, Joe Biden gave her the assignment of solving the problem on the southern border, and that's been an absolute catastrophe. So she dabbled in that for a while and then ran away from it. She has a lot of difficulty managing people. There's been just repeated shocking staff turnover in her office, and her poll numbers are terrible. And this is one of the problems. If they could persuade him to stand aside, would they then have a contest in which they could pitch one of their good governors, or would it automatically fall to Kamala Harris? Imagine if Gavin Newsom from California and Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan were suddenly in a truncated kind of primary contest or convention contest with Kamala Harris. The Democrats then would project disunity and chaos. And in a sense, without being too censorious, this is where Joe Biden's, I think you've got to say, selfishness has left the Democrats, because it's very hard to get an elegant dismount now, whereas if he'd said a year ago, I had one job, which was to stop Trump. I've done that now. Now I'm handing over to a new generation of Democrat leaders, and I've got a wonderful vice president, but I'm not going to interfere in the primary process. We've got fabulous Democrats, blah, blah, blah. You could have got, I mean, that's what Ronald Reagan did at the end of his second term, and his successor, George Herbert Walker Bush, won a very convincing election as a result. But Biden is now, whatever happens, it's just going to be very messy, it seems.
There is a dark horse in this race, which is Michelle Obama, whose name is being mentioned, including by some senators. Is she a real prospect to consider herself a candidate for the Democratic nomination if all those things do happen, Greg, or is that a complete red herring?
No, I think she is a very real prospect. She's a very real prospect, and she could very well win. And if she won, that's democracy. Now, I think her candidacy would be regressive, because her qualification is that she was the spouse of a president and has a tremendous celebrity identity. Now, let me hasten to say the absolute prime progenitor of this is Donald Trump. So Donald Trump went from reality TV to politics, and in a sense he was a genius. I'm no big fan of Trump's by any means. Now, Michelle Obama really, in terms of public policy, has a thinner resume than Barack Obama had when he ran, but she's a very convincing media performer. It'd be hard for Trump to beat up on her without looking like a horrible bully. So she could certainly unite all the factions of the Democratic Party. No one would be wanting to be beating up on Michelle Obama. So I think she is quite seriously in the mix.
Lucky for you, Greg, you're not the White House Chief of Staff, but if you were, what would you be telling Joe Biden to do?
Joe Biden has to stand down. There's still quite a few months before the election. If he had an address to the nation next week in which he said, I've given my whole life to this nation, I love this nation, I serve the nation doesn't serve me. It's clear to me now that I'm not in the best position to contest the election against Trump. He'll still get a lot of criticism for not having done it beforehand, but there will be a wave of characteristic American sentimentality. I mean, a lot of things in Joe Biden's past you wouldn't really like, when he was plagiarising British politicians, or when he was a friend of the Ku Klux Klan, and when he was opposing busing and all the rest of it, when he was tremendously anti-abortion, now he's tremendously pro-abortion. But none of that will matter. But probably he would then want to coronate someone if he could, and that would be very tricky. All of that, complex and difficult as it is, will be much easier than continuing to run. Having said all of that, it's still possible he could win the election. I wonder whether this might not mean that the judge decides to put Trump in jail, because if Trump is likely to win the election, that makes him a much bigger threat to democracy in the view of the Democrats than he was 2 weeks ago. You know, Peter Jennings once said of Trump, the world needed Captain America and instead we got the Incredible Hulk. The thing about the Incredible Hulk is you can't blow him up. You keep raining down weapons on top of him and he's still there. This could move into intense warfare. Biden could be persuaded to stand aside. As a kid, I used to watch World Championship Wrestling, and the commentator used to say, this is World Championship Wrestling where anything can happen and probably will. That's American politics at the moment.
Greg Sheridan is the Australian's foreign editor. Relatives of missing woman Bronwyn Winfield believe her body is in Lake Ainsworth on the New South Wales far north coast. That's the revelation in a new episode of our cold case investigative podcast, Bronwyn, available now to the Australians' subscribers at bronwynpodcast.com.